everyone. My name is Michelle, an education counselor from INTI International University and Colleges Malaysia. INTI offers a wide range of programs like business, arts and design, physiotherapy, law, and more. One of our most famous programs will be our 3+0 business program, whereby we partner with the University of Hertfordshire, UK. In other words, you will be able to obtain a foreign degree at an affordable cost. If you're interested to study in INTI and would like to find out more but you're unsure how due to the current lockdown situation, don't fret. Stay at home and let me help you. Do book an online counseling session with me as per the details seen. Stay home, stay safe, and see you online soon.
Today, when we are looking at on day 4 of our conference, when we're looking at the future of skills, we are so pleased to welcome Amanda Brock. She is the CEO of Open UK, and she will be talking about opening the door to the future with open technology. Amanda is the chair of the Open Source and Intellectual Property Advisory Group of the United Nations Technology Innovation Labs. She's also the European representative of the Open Invention Network, the world's largest patent pool which defends open source software. And she's also the co-founder and executive editor of the Journal of Open Law, Technology and Society. In this session, Amanda shares with us her insights in the world of open and 3 different components of this world, not only software but also hardware and data. She also talks about the importance of future-proofing the youth and the impact that openware and open has on saving the environment and in the sustainability debate. Hi Amanda, welcome to the Inspired Conference. We are so privileged listen with your experience and in the field of technology and open technology to share your nuggets of wisdom and insight into the use of open technology and the role that it will play in the future. So thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you very much for having me along today.
When I look at your CV and I see the extent of experience and involvement you've had in this area, I thought I'll just kick off with a very quick question, and that is, what made you choose technology, or what is the personal attraction for you, Amanda?
I would say that I didn't choose it, it chose me. And I was interviewed fairly soon after I qualified as a lawyer by a company to join them, and I was expecting to join them to do intellectual properties, copyright, trademarks, that kind of thing. And the lady who was interviewing me, I would say I wanted to be an IP lawyer. I was very junior, and she said to me IT, and I kept repeating IP, and she kept saying IT. And before I knew, I was hired to be an IT lawyer and was being trained by somebody really inspirational and excellent, ahead of her time in her field. So I ended up there by accident, and I stayed because what I found was I like new, I like innovation, I like to constantly be learning, and technology offers you that, and it's great to be part of it.
That often happens to us, right? We have a plan that we make for the future, and then the future or we go into other directions. So maybe, since we are talking about open technology, we could start off by just asking, what is open technology? Can you give us a definition, and maybe, what are the different kinds of open we find today?
I think that's the right question to ask, to be quite honest. And most people will not have heard of the term open technology. We're one of the first organizations in the world going ahead and being very clear, not just that we represent the open source communities, but that we represent open technology. So what that is technology that involves collaboration and sharing. It's open source software, open hardware, and open data. We call it the three opens. So open source software is software which allows the recipient to use it, to share it, and to modify it. And open hardware is something similar. Open data, again, it allows the openness of the data to be shared amongst those who want to use it. So it's something that's shared with the intellectual property, back to that subject again, the copyright in it being shared to allow that freedom, and that freedom comes from a license. So the licensing of the copyright is what makes it open.
That's very interesting. So is there a boundary in terms of technology? I mean, is it sort of, can we say it's only relevant from this starting date, or you need this kind of technology, or when did the idea originate of
Yeah.
opening up these three areas?
It's something that the further I've got into, particularly open source software, which is what my background has been in, the further I've got into it, the more I've understood that we've come full circle. So this kind of technology, IT, computer technology, what, 50, 60 years old, maybe 60, 70? You can take it back much further in terms of looking at things like algorithms. But if we stick to the 60s, when people really started to do a lot of development, at that point in time, when they first created software, there was no copyright. So copyright applies to a creative work, and it hadn't been allocated to software at that stage. So at a point in time, the people who make the laws, the regulators, decided that copyright should be protected as a creative work, and the author or the creator of that work should be recognized and given these rights to allow them to stop others using it. So before that, it was open effectively. And that decision to apply copyright to software is really important. What we've then seen is a natural cycle where, as technology has become a bigger part of our lives and more software is developed that can do more and more functional things in our day-to-day existence, more code has been created, more copyright has been created, and we've also seen patents start to become very popular around software. So we've seen this sort of natural progression of protectionism, and we've also seen a cycle of development of technology per se away from intellectual property. So if you look, my old boss, Mark Shuttleworth, coined this. If you look through the lens of the past, you see ownership of software and other technology in the hands of the few. And today it's very, very different. Today software is pervasive and it's in the hands of the many. So we've seen this natural evolution, and I think the requirements for it to be open are just a natural part of that cycle.
So it makes a lot of sense, because it's so hard to put a fence around it. And also at the same time, when we talk about the future, it is about collaboration. It is about the synergy, the shared ideas that lead to better and improved ideas. But where would there be an issue with, if you talk about IP, usually people will protect what they've developed because there's a profit motive. So in
Absolutely.
terms of this, how do those two forces work together?
I think that again is very important, and it's something that's often been misunderstood. So it's really important to understand that you still have copyright. Even although something is open, somebody holds the copyright in it. That doesn't evaporate. What happens is that they license it in a way that allows others to use it and to share it and to modify it, and sometimes require you to contribute back. Now, when you've licensed it for it to be open, there is no discrimination across field of use. So what does that mean? It means that you can't say this can only be used for evil or this can only be used for good. Once it's licensed, anyone who wants to come along can pick it up and run with it. that also means your competitors can pick it up and run with it. So it's very important, if you want to build a business using open, that you start by working out what your business model is and how you're going to generate revenue and have a success that allows you to pay for your excellence over time, and how you're going to license your intellectual property and balancing those two. Data is slightly different. With data, you're looking at a data model. And what we're seeing is not just individuals and companies, but whole states and continents moving to data models, understanding that data is at the epicenter of their financial models of the future. So understanding your business model around that is really important.
So, and everybody talks about the importance of data, and I think, and this is like in a very user-friendly or very everyman's understanding of it, but one thing that raised, I think, in the public's eye, the importance of data is the coronavirus, right? The COVID data that's being shared on a daily basis almost, you know, now how believable that data is and who generates the data and who collects the data. I mean, that's another thing, but I think people have become more aware of what data can do. So it's an interesting point that you make, that data is the cornerstone of the future. Can you give a little bit more of elaborate on that idea a bit more?
Yeah, what we've seen is, along with open, people giving you things for free. And as we've developed as humanity, I suppose, in the West, particularly with smartphones. Now, the first iPhone only came out in 2008. Android had its first release that year. So we're looking at 12 years. And in those 12 years, we've seen cycles of development that get us to a point where we use our phones and we use the apps on the phones and other devices we have to do practical things. So I don't know about you, but I do my washing, I do my banking, I hire cars, almost everything. You know, I do my shopping, about my day-to-day existence comes through that phone. Yeah. So whenever it's lost or stolen, you know, my world implodes and I have to find all the passwords again. It's a nightmare. But our worlds revolve around these phones. Now, what that means is that you're inputting data. And you're inputting data and you're often getting a service for free. So I've used Gmail, it must be a decade. You're getting a free service there. Back in 2000, I worked for an internet service provider, putting internet into people's home for free. And it was the first time that that had happened, where there wasn't a charge for an internet service over and above your phone service. So all of these things, you know, nobody is giving you something for nothing. They have to, well, that's not strictly true. With open source, you do get something for nothing, but they still have to generate revenue in the background. As I've said, they have to have their own business model. And it's sort of, it's caught up on us. I don't think it was sneaky, but people didn't always understand what was happening and the permissions they were giving. So I actually think one of the silver linings of the pandemic has been the understanding of how apps work, the understanding of the data you're giving and the permissions you're giving people, whether it's your government or Apple and Google or whoever's seeing your data through a track and trace app. We're beginning to be very aware in the public conscience of how our data is used. And the reason it's been possible to give you the free services is that a lot of what's sold to you is data driven. So the algorithms will, you know, nobody's reading your email, we hope, but they're looking through it with an algorithm which picks up on keywords like I need to buy a new car, and suddenly you'll find that you're getting targeted marketing. And a lot of the time what we hear from the good guys working on this kind of stuff at the moment is that the data-driven model should give control to the user. So it should come back to individual sovereignty, you know, where we control our own data, we understand what's happening with it. So I don't know if you saw, and I think it was in May, at one point I knew the exact date, but if you look in your Android or Apple phone and you go into your health data, they've added, I believe around the world, a functionality that's just waiting for you to tap it to switch it on. And that's the Google, Apple, Guian background app for your track and trace for your local country. So, it was just added. It was easy for them just to update that overnight simply because they have the control of the operating system on your phone.
It's
So
quite
data is
interesting.
important.
Yeah, it's, and I think the awareness, I think is really, really important, because at the end of the day, I mean, if you are a software developer and you said when you make your data or your programs, your software or your hardware open,
Mm,
you still would have some kind of a business plan, right? Nobody's going to sit and
you
say,
should.
oh, I'm just doing this for the world, So is there a point where the individual can lose control or cannot get the benefit of the way that goes into the market or in
Mhm.
general use, that you lose that input that you've given originally?
So I think there's two or three different things in what you've said that we should unpack. The first one is that nobody just gives it away. For years, the open source people have been doing that. They have been just giving it away, and that is at the epicenter. This greater good and need for collaboration. Um, some of that is a hobbyist approach with people's personal and individual desire to make the world a better place, to collaborate, to create things that they can just do easily that actually might have a huge value if they were being done in a commercial environment. So software for these people and the hardware design is a hobby, a personal interest. So there is an element of that being just given away. At the same time, I think it's probably fair to say today the vast majority of that is now paid for by corporates. So people who are willing to do that on their own time very often today will have a job doing that, and the corporate will pay for their time in contributing to projects. And they do that because what we find ourselves in is a state where software is pervasive. Every company either has its product created, distributed, or consumed through technology and through software. So for almost every company on the planet, there is an interest for it in having these technologies. And almost everybody wants to create the same technologies. Now, to do that, we could all go and create our own individual ones, which is expensive and time consuming and may not be the best or most diverse product, or you can collaborate and create it. So what we find is increased levels of collaboration, creating these products, which allows more diversity, which is a good thing when it comes to data. And then go back to your point on data, the sort of third point there. I think there is a risk to us all as individuals, and that's been recognised by governments. And in Europe, we've seen GDPR last year, the General Data Protection Regulation. Anybody who was in Europe in May 19 would have seen, a raft of emails coming through from companies asking you to reaffirm your permission for them to use your data and updating you on their privacy requirements. Now, what that's done is sort of double check if the companies had been doing the right thing in the beginning and applying to or complying with the letter of the law, they probably didn't need to do very much. But that should have cleaned up everybody's act, and it should have given you, the user, more control over your data. What I think we'll see next is organizations building products that allow us to manage our data. So you may already see on your devices products which allow you to capture all of your passwords in one place. I think we'll increasingly see products that allow us to control our data in the same sort of way, know who you've given permission and whether you've given them permission to simply send you information relating to the product you've signed up for, or to do direct marketing, or to share your data. And then also I think we'll see more around, I would call it geopolitical activities. So things like the recent case in the European courts saying that the US doesn't have adequate privacy in place.
It's very true. I have seen and received so many of these emails, of especially from Europe-based companies updating their data. And what I've found as a user is that sometimes when you install an app or something on your phone, on your computer, you don't seem to have a choice as to, they say, well, you give us permission to access your files, to do this, and you
Mm.
can't. There's no like, okay, maybe I'll accept these two, but I don't want that one. You
Yeah,
still, if you, and many times I was really eager to use it, but I grudgingly gave that permission
yeah.
because I don't always understand what is it that I'm actually giving them permission to do. they can
Mm-hmm.
read your emails, or they can control your images, or, whatever. So I
Mm-hmm.
think that's quite an educational task as well, to educate people to understand what is that permission that they are actually
Yep.
giving.
I agree with you, and I think that is that one of the silver linings is that from the pandemic, because the track and trace apps have really hit the public imagination, and people have suddenly been very, very clearly told in the media, your government is going to track you, your government is going to know who you've been in contact with. I don't think the media have always handled it terribly well. I think there's been a lot of sensationalization, but what it's done is made people aware with respect to track and trace of things that actually already happen. And a lot of people weren't aware that other apps track them. You look at your map functionality in your phone, it knows where you are.
Yeah.
So I think it's created an awareness that's good, and hopefully on the back of that, there will be more education. Although I think you'll probably find if you ask a child, they have much more idea of how to control their data than we do already.
I think it's and it's one of the themes in our conference, where we're looking at the impact that technology has on our lives, and will increasingly have in the future. And there's always a benefit, and an I don't want to say negative, but an awareness that we have to develop of what potentially could be the downside of this technology. And one thing I've noticed, and I find it quite uncanny, and I sometimes wonder if it's because I am just suspicious, but you'll be talking with your friends about something, and then you go on Facebook and suddenly you get an advertisement that's absolutely related to what you've been talking about. So, you don't know, maybe I'm just a little bit suspicious of this tracking, but it's quite uncanny how that sometimes happens. Now, would you say, Amanda, that with this movement towards open technology, which for me makes a lot of sense, because you don't have 50 people, thousands of people reinventing the same
Yeah.
wheel. You can rather use something, improve it, expand on it, build on it. Is there then still room for people developing traditional IP that's not accessible? I mean, what is the tension between open and
Yeah.
closed technology?
I think the tension is much reduced. And, I started working in this in 2008. I joined a company called Canonical, one of the biggest open source companies in Europe, probably one of the biggest in the world, right at the beginning of 2008. And I think that was probably quite early stage. And then I was the head lawyer there, and I did a lot of contract negotiation. And what that meant was I was talking mainly to technology companies at that stage. And it was a case of getting this through their legal team, and there was resistance, because you have to almost unlearn what you know about protectionism and start from fresh on the basis that we're going to collaborate and share. And this is how we do it. And it's not a case of everybody grabbing what they can, which I think is healthier to start with. But what we've seen is in the last decade, a massive shift. So the expansion of the verticals, the different areas that this open technology has seeped into, across things like mobile network operators, telecom companies, across automotive with all the infotainment systems in your car's computer. So we've seen massive, massive shifts. I think the best example, and the one that I tend to give when I'm speaking at conferences, is Microsoft. So Microsoft's former CEO, Steve Ballmer, famously called open source a cancer, and he was threatening to attack it on a patent basis. Today, Satya Nadella is asking to be judged not by the past, but by the present and the future. And he's very public about this as their current CEO. And the reasons are that customers now ask for this open technology, and they didn't a decade ago. They now use cloud computing, and interestingly, open source software underlies almost all of the internet and almost all of public cloud. So to run Azure, Microsoft has to be able to use open and contribute back to it. If you're a sophisticated user, you won't just want to use, you'll want to give back. And that's something that it's part of a natural pathway. You start by adopting and using, then you modify, then you contribute back, and then you become part of a community. And the third thing is that Microsoft unsurprisingly recruits developers, but many companies now, companies that aren't traditional tech companies, also recruit developers. And in Microsoft's story, as well as saying that customers want to buy this, cloud is built on it, developers want to work in this way. It's considered the norm. It's considered, the state of the art, the right way to work, and the good way to work, because many of them were born after 1989, when the Linux kernel, the seminal piece of open source software, was developed, and they've grown up with it. Their whole development career, this has been what they do. So if you want to hire the best, which most people do, that's the way to do it, is to be open.
That's very interesting, and it underlines or strengthens this sort of generation gap where Gen Zs are born into technology.
Yeah.
For them, there's no barrier, I think, fear that older people still have in having this past history of how it used to work, and for them, as you say, this is how it's done, and they don't even question it. So if you are you saying then that anybody can, or everybody can contribute to open source? Anybody can.
Well, across open technology, I think, yes, you can. And you're aware we've just launched a kids camp that I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about. And one of the things that camp does is it goes through a story with different protagonists, where we end up explaining community and contribution. And contribution, of course, comes from developers, because developers are creating the software, they're creating the hardware, they're creating the infrastructure for the data. But actually, it's much broader. There are people who create the user experience, people who create the user interface, the look and feel. The branding, the marketing, the coloring, the design. So you have all of that. You have translations across the different languages. You have people who manage communities and get engagement and create activities. You have people like me who work on governance, and making sure that things are done in a way that protect it and make it right for the future. And then you have also people like me doing things like advocacy and activism, engaging in the whole storytelling. So there's a huge array of different activities around any of these technologies to build a community.
That's very comprehensive, and I think we don't always think of it in such a broad, holistic way. You just see the actual developer sitting at the computer writing the code, but there's so many more dimensions that are involved. Now, if we think about the future, I mean, how can open technology, for example, contribute to cities of the future?
That's really interesting. So we're actually working on a couple of projects around that within Open UK. I couldn't tell you the exact figures. It's not the thing I'm good at, but I know that if you look at taking open technology and running open hardware with open source software running on top of it, you reduce the amount of hardware that's needed. And that's a significant reduction. It's tens of percentages. In my head, I have 70%, but it might not be quite as high as that, because that's huge. Now, if you reduce the amount of hardware, the amount of servers that are running and are using up power and generating heat, you reduce the consumption and you reduce the carbon emissions. And that's one of the key issues around open, is that we bring this to the table. We bring that green technology. It's part and parcel of what we have here, as well as the sharing and collaboration. And what we see is, as we move into smarter cities, more and more of our lives will be dictated by technology. And I don't mean it will tell you what to do, but increasingly, I used to live in Amsterdam, and I'd walk down the street and my phone there would move from one internet service to another, from all the different cafes and hotels and places that I might go to work or meet people. And that same sort of sensor utilization in your device, or whether that's a Fitbit or a phone, is something that is going to be increased in our cities. Another project we're working on, away from the sort of hardware utilization, is looking at the effects of pandemic and opening up pandemic data. And we're splitting that into neighborhoods. how have our neighborhoods changed? How can we use the data from the pandemic to see that where somebody might have had an activity, say they were a chef working from home, actually they're now busy enough because people are at home and in their local neighborhood that they want deliveries, or they're busy enough to have a little shop locally that wouldn't have been sustainable before. You know, you now have people in their home neighborhood much more. So we're looking at neighborhoods, we're looking at the social centers of towns and cities, because the patterns there are different. We believe people will go back to offices, they will go back to theatres, they will go back to the neighborhoods like Soho in London that attract a lot of activity and hubbub, but that might be in a different way and in different patterns. So we're looking at it from neighborhoods, from these social centers of towns and cities. And then the third thing we're looking at is travel and vacationing and how that will change. So you can bring all of this openness to the environment in different ways. That's open data. We can look at how technology will change around us, and more of the functional activities will become digitized.
It's exciting. You know, it's
Yes.
exciting to think that, you know, so many people are caught up in a state of fear, fearing what the future holds, fearing the fact that things might not be the same. But
Mm,
why hold on to the same when what you are explaining is so exciting? I mean, you could
mm,
then have this whole urbanization trend, or really, really busy inner cities, the decentralization
yeah.
happening and making people's lives so much better because you don't have to travel into a busy city. It reduces your time on the road, which in itself can then have further positive effects, reducing greenhouse gas, reducing accidents, you know. So, I
Mhm.
mean, it's something to be excited about. And I think it's all great to think for entrepreneurs who are considering new designs or innovations, looking at the user
Mm.
need and what this technology and this data could actually offer them in order to spark ideas for the future.
Absolutely. And
So,
one of the things you hear a lot is the pandemic being described as a pivot point. And I think the technology being open as we develop this, it does a few different things. One is that it encourages innovation because it removes barriers and it allows, as you say, reuse and development of existing. It also takes away the barriers of intellectual property, things like patents being collaboratively shared in patent pools like Open Invention Network for open. That means that instead of having to spend the huge amounts of money and take the time to register patents to protect yourself, you can work in collaboration around them and freely license each other. So you remove barriers, and that in itself encourages innovation. But from an individual perspective, one of the things it does is create transparency. Because as all of this development happens, we want to know that it's been done in the right way. We want to know what's going on. You know, you've said that sometimes you have concerns about how your data's been used, or you give it grudgingly. And it's important, I think, for all of us to understand and to have some level of control.
mm,
And that's one of the things that the opening up gives us, because we may not all be able to go into GitHub or GitLab and assess the quality of somebody's code. But if we know that others around us who have that experience can, and we know that people who want to guard our privacy are challenging it and checking it, I think if you look at track and trace in Germany and Ireland, I've spoken to people involved in it in both countries. And one of the things that those governments have done is specifically work with the privacy advocates. They've opened up their code, they've opened up the app so that they can be seen, and they've asked them for opinions and feedback to remove concerns. And I think that really is a great example of how this can work to protect us.
that's and it's being mindful and being aware. So, what would you say is the role of education? I mean, what
Yeah.
should and could be done, and what are the benefits?
Mm,
Because traditional models are still very much siloed. You know, if
mm.
schools are competing with each other, different systems, different curriculums. So, how do you see the future of education and
Mhm.
this whole open world?
Yeah, you know, my background is not education, so I'll start by saying that I'm not an expert here. I do, however, understand that for us to have communities that exist on a long-term basis, and for us to create the right environment, we need to educate people. And we need to educate them in a way that is forward-looking, creating the skills of the future, not the skills of the past or even the skills of today. And I think that when I look at the developers, I know a huge number of them have dropped out of traditional education models. A lot of them have made much more money than I can dream of, and they've worked in software companies. They've been considered nerds and geeks. They've probably not been the hip kids in school, but they've developed the right skills because they're interested and because they're bright, and they've gone off and done it their own way. So what I see from it, and what I see from the little I know in education of girls, is that a lot of hands-on activity, as opposed to traditional academic pushed learning, works well in these areas. So I think you have to look at the step by step, introducing the sort of cutting edge almost of technology, taking them into the forward, inspiring them. But I think the practical approach is going to work much better. You know, it's not open technology, but I took my 6-year-old nephew a couple of years ago into the Apple store in Regent Street in London, and the delight that he had in competing, because he's very competitive, with other kids on a coding activity where they were taking this little robot ball around the room and learning code in blocks, because there's lots of software languages developed that allow kids to learn in that sort of simple way, and to do these practical activities. So what we've focused on, we do want to create an apprenticeship scheme and a certification for the UK in open technology. But what we've started with is both a competition, because kids get engaged that way, and also a summer camp with lessons. And the lessons are, here's how to do this, go off and do it. And we've given them the practical, the kits to go off and do those practical things. And we're finding that that's creating massive engagement, particularly amongst girls. The feedback that I've had generally is that girls think coding is going to be boring. And then they get this activity that allows them to make music with the Mini Moog Love that we're using, and they engage. And I think that's the key. It's teaching them the skills of the future in a way that's engaging and practical, and allowing them to want to do it. I think there's also a sort of normalization element there, where we accept that everybody is going to have to understand some level of coding or using technology day to day in their jobs. So, the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, I think you add some level of coding to that for the future.
That's a really important aspect. I think something that's holding it back is that schools, teachers, the teaching profession, even the teaching of teachers have not caught up with it. And there's such a big divide between what the younger generation already knows and what teachers who are teaching them know. And that how do you bring this in without actually making it open and opening this up for connecting learning and the world, rather than keeping it in these enclaves. So what about curriculum then? I mean, would you say, or the traditional school, do you think that homeschooling is a big trend now, right? And a lot of parents do not want to send their kids. And then you have your MOOCs, and you have institutions like Udacity that is providing, and you talking now about accreditation in open, in open. For me, that's the future of education.
I think so too.
How do we bridge that gap?
Yeah, it's interesting. You just made me realise that today's the day the Scottish schools go back. The holidays in Scotland are much earlier than the rest of the UK. My 2 nephews go back to full-time schooling today, obviously in a very different world to the one that they were in 6 months ago. And I know that there's a level of nervousness, but I believe most parents will be sending their kids back to school. I think you're right, there is an element of homeschooling. I can't talk to statistics because I'm not an educationalist by background, but my understanding is that from personal experience, from talking to kids, is that the children who get into coding tend to get into it because there is somebody influencing them,
Yeah.
right? There's a role model in the background there. Sadly, too often male, and I think that will change generationally. But at the moment in time that we're talking about, when I speak to kids, first of all, if their teacher is not engaging, they won't do computer science. Secondly, the ones who really get into it tend to be kids whose, sadly, as I said, male parent is interested in it and will encourage them to tinker, will make it okay for things not to work when they try it out. And then from an open perspective, it's the ones who actually are contributors to open technology themselves, whose kids pick up on it. So there is a sort of duty on all of us, and there is, I think, maybe steps that we need to take to encourage that. So with our kids camp, clearly all of this needs funded. And we did a lot of this. We did the vast majority of the work on that was done by volunteering. There was a level of payment from a level of sponsorship, but that probably covered 10% of our costs. And that's not something that would be sustainable across education. But if I look at what we created, we've effectively made the coding into e-zines, the learning about computer science into something engaging. And we've made the actual lesson that you sit through in a structured way, short and animated, to try and engage and to try and make it fun. But importantly, it's shared Creative Commons, so it's shared open. So we've asked to be credited with the work we've done because so much of it has been volunteering. But anybody else can take that. So we're hoping other organisations will come to us and want our help in doing things like translations, or maybe even go off and do it themselves, creating a voiceover in Portuguese or French, whatever it's going to be. And I think that openness and that sharing, we have to, as an organisation, put our money where our mouth is. So we've created something with a lot of sweat equity in it, and now we're giving it away. Another aspect of that is digital inclusion and making sure that kids have got access to technology. And that's really, really important. We were sponsored by Huawei, who allowed us to give away 3,000 glove kits to kids. So 3,000 kids, many of whom would not otherwise have been able to, have access to the technology to do the course, get the opportunity. But importantly, it's not just our giveaway. There's an aspect, they need a microbit. Now, they can go and buy one if they have the money, but if they don't, they can borrow those in the UK from libraries. And that kind of thing is what will make the difference, actually creating real access to technology.
Yeah, and that's a really good thing for us to also talk about a little bit further. We'll look at a little bit more about at the company and what your philosophies are and what it is that you're doing. But I think for our participants in this conference and of course beyond, because we're making this available for 365 days, is that they can, and maybe you can share a link, Amanda, to people that might be interested in learning more about this, because this is something that I, for one, would love to follow up with and share in my learning communities and organizations that I know that are working in this area on promoting digital literacy. So that is fantastic. And I'm sure that the fact that you're making this available for translation or for people maybe to modify to fit more into their own context, but to learn from this experience would be great. How are you measuring the success? How are you going to say this really worked?
Yeah, in all honesty, I don't yet know. In terms of a link, openuk.uk/openkidscamp, and we can put the physical link, but openuk.uk is very easy to remember /openkidscamp. I remember someone challenging me on this project as we were bootstrapping it at the beginning of the year and saying to me, what are your KPIs? And honestly, we're relatively new, we're relatively young, we are not that structured or formal yet. Personally, I look at the social media traction and I look at the download, which is beginning to pick up pace. I think when we come to re-engaging in September, that will be our time to sit down and regroup and strategically work, how do we go forward? So we're looking at building work streams around a certification and an apprenticeship scheme. At the same time, we'll look at this kids camp has actually come off. You know, we've pulled it off, we've made it happen. What was good, what was bad? Was it successful, and how do we then measure the next stage of success? I think also for me, the fact that people like you are talking to me about it and that it's available. So episode 2 has just been launched this morning, and the fact that that's actually there for us as the success, delivering it at this stage in our development as our success.
Well, we hope that our conference goers will take up this challenge and would take this on and learn from this, share this, and maybe work, innovate and share back with you. So that's really, really exciting. And it's a very important point that you mentioned, is sometimes people, and this is something that a lot of people have in this conference, a lot of people that we've spoken to, is that fear of, or that clinging to perfection. So many people have ideas, but I'm too scared to try it. Or I'm not saying you shouldn't have a clear plan and that you should know where you're going to.
Yeah.
But you should do that research, but you should also not let the fear of it not being perfect hold you back from doing it. Because as
absolutely.
you say, that is what innovation is about, right? It is about iteration and review and learning from your not mistakes, but what could or mistakes. I mean,
Our mistakes.
we learn from that, right? So if we keep on saying, well, I don't know, I don't have that clear, I don't exactly know it, we are not going to progress as a humankind. So there's just so much to be learned from that experience. It's quite a problem, access to technology and the internet in developing countries. So open for me is an absolute solution, right, to countries of lower socioeconomic income. I mean, it's a solution for everybody, right? But for those countries, how do for example, work with groups of people in Tanzania, in Kyrgyzstan, in Indonesia, in Lebanon, India, even here in Malaysia. We've done research during the COVID and learning from home with public schools. And we find that there's one of the biggest barriers is access to the technology, to the internet, as well as devices. Now, you've mentioned one solution, and that is you could borrow a device. What would you say is the future of making internet more across the world?
It's interesting, and you're bringing together a lot of different threads of my career. I was 50 last year, almost exactly a year ago, and I started talking about 50 years and the development of technology and, where we'd come to over those 50 years. 20 years ago, I was working in the internet, and a lot of the technologies that are changing our world today existed then. They just didn't get mass adoption in the UK and across the West. And the reason was generally connectivity. So I understand better than many that it's absolutely at the core of making technology work for us rather than us work for technology. You mentioned Tanzania, and that sort of triggered an alarm bell for me. So for a couple of years, I worked in digital financial services in emerging markets. So working in countries where the unbanked were prevalent. People didn't have access to financial services because they didn't have bank accounts. They couldn't qualify for one. They didn't have the kind of technology many of us are used to with cards, whether you're signing or tapping in a shop. And what was happening in those countries where they were actually leaping ahead of the West because they didn't have this sort of barrier of historical artifacts or ways of doing things. And what was happening was they were using their phones So they went straight to phone technology for finance and paid with a phone, transferred money with a phone. And I was working in countries like Pakistan, and we were building this infrastructure. And I was very proud of it because it was helping people and it was doing something that I perceived as, being really useful and good. I went there a couple of times and I saw people actually benefiting, particularly women, interestingly, taking small business loans where they'd become the responsible person in the family. $500 made a huge difference to them and they were able to access this through this technology. So it was good to see, but it wasn't open. And what we're now seeing is an increase in technology. Give you an example of something called Mojaloop. And Mojaloop is a payment platform that's come out of the Gates Foundation. It's now got its own foundation run by a friend of mine, Paula Hunter. And Mojaloop has already been implemented in Tanzania, which is why you made me think of it. And it's an open payment platform. Now, what's good about that is not just that you have the transparency and the collaboration around it being open, but there's that old saying, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day, teach a man to fish and you feed him for life. So what that actually does is, if you look at Mojaloop, and I'm sure you'll be interested in, Paula, and I'm happy to introduce you, is if you look at that, they are building communities locally where people are learning to code, learning to contribute, and that makes the difference.
Yeah.
And increasingly, actually, Africa is one of the places that I think there was the first big conference for open development last year in Nigeria, which, is a big step forward. In the rest of the world, there are very few places that we're not seeing that kind of thing happen already. So yeah, I think open technology really will help there. It removes a lot of the cost barrier. I also chair an advisory group for the United Nations for the Technology Innovation Labs on intellectual property and open source. And again, we see something similar, which, I'm speaking on my own account, not theirs. But when you open things up, you meet their goals. You move towards the digital development goals.
Yes.
Simply by creating that free to access software, by creating things that are scalable and low cost, it's very, very important.
So
Sorry, I was just going to say that the sustainable development goals tend to be more met by that, in my opinion.
Yeah, and that's also one of the aims of our conference, is really driving or forming a change community who could collaborate in an open way towards achieving the goals. Just to come back to the point of access, what about actual internet access? How can that be made more effective? So I'm going to go back to Tanzania as an example. I can also mention Malaysia, in the more rural areas of Borneo, where actual physical access to the internet itself is just there. So when you drive, when you do online learning, when you do open learning courses, they actually physically cannot connect. Is there some kind of new development that you can foresee that could help that?
Not that I'm aware of, and primarily the question is money. And actually, if you look at the UK, it's not. There are still a few areas where people would push back and say they don't have the access they need. And it's only in very recent years. I used to have a cottage in Wales, way out in the west, and I was stunned by how poor the internet was. And you're only talking a decade ago. This has been a gradual process, a gradual progress. And I think it's just a question of catching up, but it will take investment.
It will take time, but it's also true that most in the survey that we did recently with a large number of public schools in Malaysia showed that in remote learning, it was 70% of the students indicated that they used their mobile devices rather than computers for online learning.
Yeah.
So usually, especially in a less privileged family or low socioeconomic family, there's at least a smartphone. Whether they compete for time on the phone, but but that has sort of revolutionized access to technology, to learning.
Yeah.
And I think the more work that's being done in ensuring that mobile applications are as good as the web
Hmm.
application itself will be really meaningful. And using
Hmm.
stuff like WhatsApp. I mean, WhatsApp has been instrumental in the
Hmm.
learning networks in Tanzania that I work with, so using open technology really is the answer. Would you tell us a little bit more about your company and what it is that you do? What are the policies? I know that the pillars upon which Open UK is built.
Yeah. So we're a relatively young organisation, and we're a country-specific organisation. We are about advocacy for open technology, I would say. I've mentioned open technology being open source software, open hardware, open data. We bring those three together, and we firmly believe that that is the future, and the future of technology, which is the future for all of us. We look at three pillars, as you mentioned, and those are community, legal and policy, and learning. And it's really quite simple for us. The community tends to be one that's engaged globally, and we're in no way dissuading people from that. We're encouraging global collaboration, but we're focusing on a geographical basis. And I think increasingly we are seeing things where for a long time we've all been very globally focused, but actually, and the pandemic really has, for many people, focused them on this. We are refocusing on our own geographical areas and our physical local communities. We had already started this with Brexit in the UK, where in no way cutting off the collaboration beyond our geographical border. We want to explore a bit more what's within our geography. So we're building what I would call a cohesive and loud community around open, because we have, I would say, thousands of people across the UK who are real experts in this, but who quite likely don't know each other. And if they don't know each other, they don't collaborate locally and they don't have a voice. And what we're trying to ensure is that even if those individuals work on projects that mean they collaborate with people, and I do this, they collaborate with people every day in the US and Australia and Asia and Africa, they still know their neighbours who are working on the same kind of things in another project, so that we can make sure that this is a great place to do open. And that's our second thing, legal and policy. So with that vibrant and loud community, we want to make sure that this is a great place to do open. And we do that through ensuring that legislation is appropriate to open. We have identified not just that we need legal and policy work, but we need to ensure that that will go forward. So for many of us who are involved in that, we're 40 plus, and we know that we need to ensure future generations coming through have our skill set. And we've set up a future leaders group there where they are actually working on government terms. They're doing a review of the procurement process in government. So we have a community that's looking at legal and policy, and they're learning, and learning is that third pillar for us. And not just the adults in our future leaders group, but as I've mentioned, we have a kids camp. The kids camp involves us doing, I suppose, digital training to provide digital skills for kids, and it's very much a first step. So in those digital skills, naturally they learn about open, because open is the technology of the future. We would see that as being a way to build awareness for us right now. It's a short 10 episode fun thing, and it's a stepping stone. And it's a stepping stone to doing more of these, but also to building appropriate curriculum. Now, the content of what we've done has actually all been reviewed by an educationalist, a lady called Pamela Bole, who works in my old high school, funnily enough, in Scotland. And Pamela has collaborated by reviewing everything we've done to make sure that it matches the Scottish and English curriculum across the UK. So I can't guarantee outside of the UK, but in the UK, the lessons should achieve the curriculum objectives. And it will be interesting to see whether we get real engagement from kids saying that they've learned things in a different way. We've already gone out. 200 kids did this as a forerunner to us opening it up. We did it in a closed environment, and we've already gone out to them. You know, you were asking me before about measures. We've gone out with a survey to see, you know, whether they found it good, bad, or indifferent. I'm sure kids will tell us exactly what they think.
So they do.
Yeah, possibly more than I want. But they will also tell us how to improve it, what would have been better. And, you know, we'll like to take that on board before we do more work on a second series or more ways of sharing this with people.
So what I can see is if other organizations from, I mean, it's that line between, or that interaction or alignment between local and global. I mean, you have to be globally aware, but as you say, there's now a much better or bigger emphasis on the community around us, because we've actually spent so much more time in our own communities. And it makes a lot of sense, because different countries, localization is always important. It helps with meaning and engagement. So other organizations could look at what you've done and could adapt that curriculum, for example, for another country, another language. I mean, you would be open to that kind of collaboration.
Absolutely. We haven't publicly shared the scripts, and we probably should. You're making me think that, but we're happy to share them with anybody who wants the scripts. And we will do the same with everything else we do. We have e-zines, which again are Creative Commons and can be taken and reused as well. So everything is there to share. And we're also being approached increasingly by other countries or people who are interested in open technology in other countries and want to set up a similar organization. I think we're a few months off that, but I would like to build a model that others can again share and collaborate on, and maybe build a grouping of those of us who are running these things in other countries.
So it makes sense to say then, rather than going for one global organization, it's almost a federation of different countries coming together, sharing the basic open software content data, but the localization aspect that makes it more meaningful for them, and you can learn from each other again, rather than just having one thing that is expanded across the world. And that's very much to the whole nature as I see, and what I've learned from you in terms of what open is all about. It is about collaboration, it's about adaptation, it's about making it, you know, adding to it and giving back to the community. So that's a great model, and it's I hope that again our community that will participate in this conference would reach out to you, would see the case for. I mean, they don't need to see the case for open. We live in an open world, right? But would those that stuck in with past mindsets would see that to survive in this VUCA world, we need to adapt, and we need to be open, to be influenced, and also to collaborate and share with others for a common goal. You've mentioned really interesting things that really stick with me. The whole concept of open hardware. I always thought of open just in terms of software, you know, and the fact that this would make such a big difference to the world in terms of carbon, in terms of sustainability. So that is something really, really fascinating for me. Thank you for sharing that. I also think the fact that you've mentioned repeatedly the whole issue of girls and girls in technology. And I wanted to ask as the last question, you as a woman in this world, how have you felt that there are barriers, or that there were things that you've had to overcome because you are a woman, or is it, do you think it's more an attitude?
I think for a lot of girls that how they are educated and brought up is the critical part. And I was always taught that I could do anything. And I think being taught that is what makes a difference. But I then went on to be absolutely shocked, and when I worked it out, horrified at some of the treatment that I received, particularly in my early career as a lawyer. And actually, I found law much more sexist than I found technology. You know, we hear a lot of complaints about technology, but law was very old-fashioned, and it's taken a long a long time to transition. And I think now we're still looking at 10-20% of the tech profession being women, and it's nowhere near enough. There is no excuse for it. But that will take time to change. We're not going to change it overnight. And it's very much just doing it, taking your place. I think these days people are less overtly sexist. So, you know, it is a bit easier than it was, but there's still a lot of work to be done. I also feel that a lot of girls, and I know I was like this, do not like the feeling that something is coming to them because they're a girl. So, you know, we want to treat everybody in the same way and not necessarily make things girl specific, I think. Not that I'm condemning those who do, and if it works and it engages girls, great. But for me, it's about everybody and being inclusive. And I think diversity is at the epicenter of everything we do. And that's not just gender, things like neurodiversity, race, creed, you know, color. For us, it is very much just accepting people as people and trying to create something that allows collaboration across everybody without discrimination.
It's a mindset change as well, isn't it? Because we have these traditional models, and you mentioned earlier, girls will say, "Oh, I don't want to do it; it's boring." Because that's the mental model. Boys sit behind computers, and you know that they play games. I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
So I think it's absolutely. And I had a very interesting conversation with a professor from Harvard who works in neuroscience, and this whole myth that, you know, girls think with this part of their brain and boys are like this. It's all conditioned. That's what it is.
Absolutely.
You know, we give boys blocks to build with, and we
Yeah.
give girls dolls. I mean, if we were to give girls the same toys we would to give boys when they were younger, and the brain architecture will differently. It's absolutely conditioning. So we all have a job to do, and that is to break down
right.
these mental models and make it open, right? Raise that awareness of the importance of, I mean, it cannot be truly open if it's not inclusive, representative,
Exactly.
and diverse. So
exactly.
that is a joint task for all of us. So Amanda, on our conference, we have the Headspace app. The app is our community app where people can post questions, where they can reflect on your session, and also where they could just maybe also look at 4 of these key themes, which was so evident from what you were talking about today: inclusion, tech, leadership, and the importance of we didn't talk so much about that, but I think it's really important and that's empathy and compassion, and really just understanding without judgment. So if you had a question to our participants that you would like them to respond to in this Headspace app, what would that question be?
Are you using open technology, and if not, why not?
That's a brilliant one. Because in order to answer that, you've got to know, well, am I using open technology? What is open technology?
Exactly.
And how do I get to, and I can't think that anybody can say I don't use it, because,
Absolutely.
It's
Absolutely. And that's it's one of the things, again, with the kids course that we take them through, is who is using it. You are, because you're using the internet, because you're using services in the cloud. So whether you know it or not, you're a user.
It's been a fascinating talk. I learned a lot, and I really appreciate you being here with us. And we will share the link to your organization
Thank you.
on the site and in our marketing, in our program material. So thank you very, very much, Amanda,
Thank you for having me.
us
Thank
your
you.
time. It was lovely.
Thanks.
You just
Take care.
it.